Masechet Baba Mesia Daf Kof. Until now, we've been talking about borrowers, and now we're going to be talking about buying and selling. But you'll see that this Mishnah has almost the exact same structure as the previous Mishnah. So here we go. Case number 1. Hamachalif para b'chamor v'yelda, v'chen mocher shifchato v'yelda. Ze omer ad shelo macharti, v'ze omer mishelakachti yachaloku. Someone does a kinyan chalipin. One person owns a cow, and the other owns a donkey, and they're switching them around. Or the second case is someone is selling a maidservant, and happens to be that she is pregnant, or in the case of the cow is pregnant, and at some point, either just before or just after the actual transaction, the cow or the maidservant gives birth. However, it's not clear precisely when it gives birth. So the seller says, oh, it gave birth before the sale, right before we actually made the transaction, either by chalipin, by actually, let's say the cow was somewhere else, so they didn't see it, and the owner of the cow pulls the donkey. As soon as he pulls the donkey, automatically the cow is transferred, but the cow doesn't have to be there. That's how kinyan chalipin works. You only need one of the things to be present. So the seller makes the claim that he did some calculation, and he claims that it gave birth before he pulled the donkey. Therefore, the offspring he keeps, because the offspring was already born. So, and when it was under his property, and then he sold the cow, they gave the cow transferred by itself. Whereas the owner of the donkey said, no, not true. It gave birth after the transaction. After you pulled the donkey, then when you pulled the donkey, it was still pregnant. So I got the pregnant cow, and now that it gave birth, I own both the cow and the offspring. Same thing for if he buys a shifcha. Here it's not kinyan chalipin. They could be using money. Generally, money does not work to make a transaction for a movable item, but servants have the law like land. And therefore, the question is, when did he pay the money? If the owner of the maidservant says, I got paid while she was, I got paid, she gave birth first, and then I got paid, and therefore the offspring I keep. Whereas the buyer says, no, I paid you. I paid you first, and then so I got the pregnant maidservant, and therefore the offspring is mine. Okay, in this case, so because we don't know who's right, and they're both making a definite claim, so yachloku, they split the difference of the value of the offspring. Hayu lo shene avadim, echad gadol ve'echad katan, v'chen shete sadot, achat gedola ve'achat ketana. Now, a new case. Someone has two slaves. One is big and strong, worth more, and one is small. Or he has two fields. One is a big, nice field, and one is small, that's worth less. And so he sells either one of the slaves or one of the fields, but it's not so clear which one it is. Usually when you write a contract for a field, you'll write, it's this parcel that's this big on the north side of that. You try to give some definite boundaries, but let's say he didn't write all that, or it's ambiguous, and now it's not clear which one he actually sold. So they have different claims. Halokech omer gadol lakachti, v'hala omer eni yodeya zacha bagadol. If the buyer says, I know for sure I bought the big one, and the seller says, you know what, I'm really not sure. So then the buyer takes the big one. Kodas bari and shema. If you have a definite claim and a doubtful claim, the definite claim wins. The same thing the other way around. Hamocher omer katan macharti v'hala omer eni yodeya en lo ela katan. If the seller says, I know for sure I sold you the small one, and the buyer says, listen, I'm not really sure which one it was, then the seller's claim is stronger, and so he just gives over the small one. Ze omer gadol v'ze omer katan yishaba mocher shekatan machar. If both have a definite claim, and one says it was the big one, and one says it was the small one, so then the seller has to to make an oath that it was in fact the small one that I gave you, and that we trust that the oath is true, and therefore he just gives over the small one. Ze omer eni yodeya v'ze omer eni yodeya yachloku. If both of them say, we don't know which one it was, we're both not clear, we both forgot, then they split the difference between them. Okay, so you see how this is the same structure as the previous Mishnah with a definite and not indefinite both ways, if they're both definite, and then if they both don't know. Gemara asks, Amai yachloku, regarding the first case of the offspring, or the cow, it says that they split it. So now the question is, why do they split it in that case? After all, they actually are both saying a definite claim, and so it's not quite like the last case where this is both not definite claims, right? Since it's both definite claims, why don't we apply a different principle in this case? Let's see, where is this offspring right now? The offspring of the cow or the baby of the maidservant? Where is it currently? So we'll leave it in the status quo, and whoever's property it's not in, that is the person who's trying to extract property from his friend, and he has to bring a proof if he wants it. So since none of them have proofs, we're talking about there's no proof. If there were witnesses that said, yes, we saw it gave birth before, gave birth after, then you surely go by the witnesses. We're talking about where there's no witnesses, so leave it where it is unless the other person can bring witnesses. Amar Rav Chiya bar Avin amar Shemuel be'omedet be'agam shivcha nameh dekaima besimta. So Rav Chiya bar Avin, in the name of Shemuel, says we're talking about a case where the animal is in a marsh. It's in nobody's domain. It went in and wandered into a marsh and it gave birth there. Or if you're talking about a maidservant, it's the maidservant's in an alley, not in the property of the buyer nor in the property of the seller, and that's why we say we'll split the difference because it's in nobody's property. Okay, even if you're not going to apply because it's in no man's land, but still you should follow the chazakah. The presumptive ownership is whoever had it last. And in this case, it would be the seller that owned the cow and owned the maidservant, since the owner definitely was the presumptuous previous owner, since he was definitely the previous owner, so we should presume that he still is the owner and let the buyer bring proof. Oh, this Mishnah is the opinion of Sumchos, who does not apply the principle rather he applies the principle of whenever there is a doubt of ownership because there's no witnesses, then you split the difference and nobody needs to make a vow. That's what we're applying here. Hold on, Sumchus, we know we said that principle when neither of them are sure. So nobody's sure, we don't know what to do. Okay, you split it. But if both of them are making certain claims, which is what the case in the Resha, right? The owner of the cow says it's mine, it's definitely mine, gave birth before. The owner of the donkey says no, it's definitely mine, gave birth after. So did Sumchus apply his principle even when they're both making definite claims? Two answers. Amar Rabba Rav Huna in Amar Sumchus afilu bebari ubari. Rabba, the son of Rav Huna, says yes. In fact, Sumchus said that even if they're both making certain claims, and therefore that's easily applicable to our Mishnah. Rava Amar leolam ki Amar Sumchus shema b'shema aval bari ubari lo amar utne ze omer shema ad shelo macharti v'ze omer shema mi shelakachti. Rava says no. Sumchus only said that we split the difference when they both have uncertain claims. If they were both certain claims, Sumchus would not have said that, and therefore we have to reinterpret our Mishnah and say that the correct wording or reading or explanation of the Mishnah is when one claims that maybe it gave birth before I sold it, and therefore, as the seller says, it's mine, and the other one says, well, maybe not. Maybe it gave birth after I bought it, and therefore it's mine. So neither is sure, and so we're talking about a case of Shema and Shema, and that's why we follow Sumchus, and he says that they split it. Now we're going to have two challenges against Rabba bar Rav Huna. Tenan. Ze omer eni yodea v'ze omer eni yodea yachloku. Now later on in the Mishnah, we have a case of the guy that sold 2 fields or 2 servants. And in that case, when you say, this guy says, I don't know, and that guy says, I don't know, we split the difference. Okay, so this is another case in the very same Mishnah. So let's see who it works with. So this makes sense according to Rava, since in the Sefa, in the case of 2 fields, we have, it's talking about a case of Shema, and they split the difference. So it makes sense that in the Resha, it's consistent. And the Resha is talking about a case of switching or buying a maidservant, and the Sefa is talking about 2 fields or 2 servants. We don't know which one it is. And so, but they're both talking about the same case, Shema v'Shema, so it's consistent. Ela d'Rabba bar Rav Huna d'Amar in, Amar Sumchus afilu bari ubari, hashta bari ubari, Amar yachloku, Shema v'Shema miba'ya. But according to Rabba bar Huna, who says that, according to Sumchus, even if they both have definite claims, they split it. So if that's true, when they have definite claims, they split it. So why do you need to even tell me about a case where they both have indefinite, uncertain claims, right? Just tell me a case where they have certain claims, and even there you split it. All the more so when they're uncertain claims, you would split it. So why would the Sefa have to teach us a case of Shema v'Shema? It could have told us a case of Bari and Bari, and then I would have known. We answer this question. Now, if it's just that, then that's not a good claim. It's not a good question. Tena sefa legaluye resha. Shelo tomar resha shema v'shema aval bari ubari la. Tena sefa shema v'shema miklal de resha. Bari ubari afilu hachi yachloku. We has to write the case of Shema and Shema in the end of the Mishnah in order to teach me how to properly read the beginning of the Shema, the beginning of the Mishnah, so that you won't say that the beginning of the Mishnah is talking about Shema and Shema, which is how Rava read it, and then I would say, but if it was definite claims, it would not be so. That's also how Rava read it. Therefore, Rabba bar Rav Huna says that the Sefa gave a case of Shema and says Yachloku there, and then since that case is Shema v'Shema, and we're not going to repeat it, so then I know that the Resha is talking about a different case. What's a different case? A bigger chidush, that even if it's Bari and Bari, nevertheless, they split it. And that way you could read the Mishnah more simply. You don't have to add in words or interpret it, and that would answer the question. Okay, another challenge against Rabba bar Rav Huna. Tenan. Ze omer gadol v'ze omer katan yishaba mocher shekatan machar. The second case clause in the Mishnah, which was talking about, again, 2 pieces of land, and the seller says, I know, I sold the big one. And the seller says, I sold you the small one. And the buyer says, no, I bought the big one. So the seller makes a vow that it was in fact the small one, and that's it. He only has to give the small one. Now this clause makes perfect sense according to Rava, because according to him, Sumchus only says that you split it when it's Shema v'Shema, and therefore that's the case of the first case in the Mishnah, where they're making an exchange, or he's buying a pregnant maidservant, so that's Shema v'Shema and Yachloku, and also in the case of 2 fields, when it's Shema v'Shema and they both don't know, also Yachloku. But this case where they are both sure, Sumchus did not say that they split it, and that's why you have to make a vow. We're going to talk about this vow extensively in just a couple of minutes, why he's making the vow. But in any case, it's not splitting. But according to the Rabba bar Rav Huna, who says that according to Sumchus, even when they both make definite claims, you split it. So why is it saying here that the seller makes a vow and gives him only the small field? The law should be that they split it in the middle. Oh, the answer is Sumchus agrees that you don't split it when there is a deoraita requirement to make a vow, because then it would not be fair. If one side has to make a vow and then they split the difference, well, that's not really equal, because one side, they're both getting the same amount, but one is making a vow and the other was not making a vow. So therefore, sumchus, when there's a biblical vow applicable, then we just go with the biblical law. Whoever makes the vow, if he's willing to make the vow, then we supports his claim, and in this case, he would just give over the smaller field, and that's it. But in general, if there's no requirement for a biblical vow, then you split the disputed amount, and that would be true whether it's Shema and Shema or Bari and Bari. Okay, good. So now we explained that first part of the Mishnah, and we're going to move on to the clause that has a vow. So, to the second case in the Mishnah, where there's two slaves, or two pieces of land, one big and one small, and both of them have a definite claim, so the seller has to make a vow. So we're asking why? Why is he making a vow? The idea is, well, what kind of vow is this? It's a biblical vow. There are three types of biblical vows. The one we're focusing on here is modeh b'miksat. Classic case of modeh b'miksat is someone claims you owe me 100, and the other guy says, I admit I owe you 50, but the other 50, not true, I don't owe you. So since if he would say, I don't know who you are, I never owe you anything, then he doesn't have to do anything at all, because the claimant does not have proof. So the defendant doesn't have to do anything. But once he admits to half, so then already it sounds like, so you do owe him something. Maybe you're admitting to half because you really owe the whole thing, but you only have half the money now, and you're stalling for time. So just to make sure the guy is not, and he doesn't want to just lie outright and say, I don't know anything to you. So therefore, we make him make a vow to prompt him, if in fact he owes everything, to admit that he owes everything. Okay, so that's the law of modeh b'miksat, the classic case of modeh b'miksat. But here, is this modeh b'miksat? We're going to have three questions, challenges to the applicability of modeh b'miksat to this case. And we're going to have to try to answer all three of them. Okay, it's going to be hard to do. So let's see. The first one. That which was claimed, he did not admit, and that's what he admitted was not claimed. Right? In the case of money, $100, you owe me $100, the other guy says 50. So 50 is part of the 100. That makes sense. But in this case, the claimant, that's the buyer, says, you owe me a big field. Okay. The seller says, I don't owe you a big field, right? That's so zero. So he's denying the entire claim. He does admit, I owe you a small field. That's a different field. It's not like it's part of that field, just like with slaves. It's not that I owe you 60% of this slave. It's two different people. And so therefore, he denied the entire claim of the big slave, and he admitted a small slave, which was not claimed. So these are two different matters. It's not modeh b'miksat. It's a full denial of that which was claimed. Okay, he also admitted, I owe you this, but that has nothing to do with the claim. So therefore, this should not be called modeh b'miksat. That's question number one. Ve'od helachu. Furthermore, it's a case of here you are. We saw this way earlier in the beginning of the Masechet. This is the opinion of Rav Sheshat. He says, let's talk about the classic case. Someone says, you owe me 100. And the other says, listen, I do owe you 50, and here it is. And he presents the money right there. So now that 50 is off the table, right? It's no longer even part of the claim. That's it. 50 is gone. And now the remaining claim is 50, and he denies that entire 50. So according to Rav Sheshat, if you pay right on the spot and say, here it is, I'm ready to give you that half that I admit to, then we just dismiss that entire amount, right? It's finished. It's a closed case. And now he's actually denying the entirety, and he does not have to make an oath. Here too, even if you'll say, we consider like the land big and the small is within the land, even if somehow you can answer the first question, the seller is saying, listen, I do owe you a small piece of land, and here it is. Go ahead, take it. And therefore, once that's off the table, so it's not modeh b'miksat. He's not admitting to part of it, because part of it is already given over, and therefore he's denying the entirety of whatever claim is left. Furthermore, we have a rule that you don't make a vow regarding slaves, slaves and land also. You only make a modeh miksat only applies to money or movable items. That's where we have to make a vow, but it does not apply to slaves and land. The slaves are like land, and that's what we're talking about here. And so now we have to answer all these three questions in order to explain why is there a requirement of a vow in the Mishnah. Now we have the first response that will answer the first and third questions, but not the second one of Helach. Amar Rav, beto'ano dame aved gadol, dame aved katan, dame sadeh gedola, dame sadeh ketana. Rav says, we're talking about a case where the buyer is not claiming the item itself, but rather he wants his money back. Maybe something happened to the slave, it died in the meantime, so he's not getting the slave. So he says, listen, I paid you for a big slave. And the other one says, no, so that's, give me $1,000. And the seller says, no, you bought only a small slave, and therefore I only owe you $600. So that, or the monetary value of a big field, or the monetary value of a small field. So actually, we're talking about money. That would solve the first problem, that the claim, the admission is part of the claim. It's the same as $100, $50. You're talking about money and money, so a little money is included within a lot of money. Not talking about two different fields or two different slaves. And furthermore, since we're talking about money, so there is a modeh miksat requirement when you're talking about monetary claims or movable items. We're not talking about actually, the claim is not for an actual slave or an actual piece of land. So that works. Now Helach still doesn't solve, because he's willing to give the amount of money for the smaller item. Okay, but at least Rav answers 2 out of 3 questions. Ushmal amar beto'ano kesut aibed gadol, kesut aibed katan, omre sadeh gedola, omre sadeh ketana. Shmuel says, no, it's not talking about the monetary value, because it doesn't say monetary value. It says, a slave, a field. But rather, Shmuel says, when he says slave, he means the garment of a big slave, which is bigger and worth more. It's worth $100. Whereas the other one says, oh, I did sell you a garment of a slave, but of a small slave, which is smaller, less material, and therefore it's a cheaper price. So that's the cheaper one. So it is in fact a movable item. Or regarding the land, he didn't buy the land itself, but rather the sheaves on a large field, which would be a lot of sheaves. He claims, you owe me, and the seller says, no, I sold you the sheaves on a small field, which is less. So we're talking about again a monetary claim regarding the value of these items, and that would also solve the first question, because the less sheaves is included in the more sheaves, and also, at least for sheaves, it will answer, and also it will answer the last question, because we do make a modeh miksat vow regarding movable items, which these are. Okay, we still have the question about the garments, which sounds like it's 2 different garments. Kesut masha ta'ano lo hodalo, masha hodalo lo ta'ano. Right, Shmuel, you didn't even answer the first question regarding the slave's garments, because these are 2 different garments. There's size large, and you owe me a size large. And the seller says, no, I don't owe you a size large, so he denies the entire claim. He admits something else, which is, I owe you a size small, but that was not part of the claim. So it doesn't even answer the first question for slaves, and the answer is it does. Kedamara papa bid yai lefe hachaname bid yai lefe. We're talking about a type of garment that's attached by putting together smaller pieces of fabric. So it's not like a size big and a size small. It's one size, but then you can add, let's say you take a piece of fabric because the sleeves are too small for a large person, and you add a cuff onto it to extend it to make it longer. So in fact, the size small is included within the large size. Kashya le Rabbi Hoshaya, midi chesut katani, abed katani. Rabbi Hoshaya asked a question against Shemuel. It doesn't say that he sold him a garment. It says he sold him a slave. How can you just change the words like that? Ela amar Rabbi Hoshaya, kegon sheta'ano ebed bichsuto v'sadeh be'omareha. So Rabbi Hoshaya, he likes Shemuel's answer, but in order to answer his own question, he modifies it. And we're talking about a case where he sold a big slave with his uniform. And the seller says, no, I sold you a small slave with his uniform. And same thing with field. He sold the field itself, but also the grain that's on top of it. And so therefore, that answers the question of the first question, that is included, right? Lots of grain is included within the small grain. And also these are movable items, that are, well, it's movable and, which we'll get to in a second. Okay, first we have to clarify, is this included? Is this a modeh b'miksat? Because aren't these two different items? V'akate kesut mashe ta'ano lo hodalo, mashe hodalo lo ta'ano, amar papa b'deyai lefe. Since the claim was a large slave and the garment, and then the admission was a small slave and a small garment, so then that's totally two different things. He denied the entire claim. Rav Papa says, no, like he said before, we're talking about an attachable section that makes the small garment bigger, and therefore it is considered a modeh b'miksat, at least regarding the clothing and that he sold and the sheaves that he sold. Now he also has the slave himself and the land itself, which we'll get to now. Kashya le Rav Sheshat zokekina talash moinan tanena zokekin nechasim she'en lahem achrayut et nechasim sheyesh lahem achrayut lishaba alehen. So now we see how Rabbi Hoshaya actually answered the third question also. Because there is a modeh b'miksat regarding the movable item, since the sheaves, a less amount of sheaves is included within the larger amount of sheaves. So that's modeh b'miksat. And it's a movable item, so that you have to make a vow on that. And we have a principle called zokikin, that you bind things together. If you're in a situation where there's a claim of movable items and land, or movable items and a slave, since the modeh b'miksat vow applies to the movable items, we bind both the whole claim together, and the modeh b'miksat has to make a vow not only on the movable part of the claim, but also on the land and slave part of the claim. So that's how Rabbi Hoshaya answered the first and third question. But now Rav Sheshash challenges that. This is obvious. That's already in the Mishnah in Masechet Kiddushin that says we bind together property that cannot be used for a guarantee, that's movable items, together with property that can be used for a guarantee, that's land. And you have to make a vow on the whole thing. So we know this already. What new thing are you coming to teach us here? Ela amar Rav Sheshat hamaneh Rabbi Meir hi damar abda kimetaltelin dameh. Rather, Rav Sheshat says, I think that our Mishnah is the opinion of Rabbi Meir, who says that a slave is like movable property. And if so, this is now yet a fourth answer to solve our question. Since a slave is like movable property, then it solves the third question. How can you be liable to modeh b'miksat? Biblical oaths only apply to movable items. Well, according to the Rabbi Meir, a slave is a movable item, so it will solve the problem. It will solve the third question for slaves. It's still not solving it for land, so we'll get to that in a few minutes. Hold on, we're back to the first question, which now Rav Sheshat is not answering, which is if you're talking about slaves themselves and not the clothing of the slaves and not the value of the slaves, which was the first answer, then this is not modeh b'miksat, because you have two different people, big slave, small slave. He denies that he owes the big slave totally. He only admits to something else. Oh, so we have to combine. Not only does our Mishnah follow Rabbi Meir, it also follows Rabban Gamliel, who says in the Mishnah in Masechet Shavuot that if someone claims, you owe me wheat. And the other one says, no, I don't owe you wheat, I owe you barley. So the Tanakama says, patur, that's not modeh b'miksat, that's a different claim and a different admission. But Amman Gamliel says that we put it together. Since he says you owe me wheat, and that's worth $100. Now he says, no, I don't know, I owe you barley, and that's worth $50. So that, according to Amman Gamliel, even though they're two different types of items, nevertheless, modeh b'miksat applies. So if we apply that here also, then even though we're talking about two different people, a big slave and a small slave, one is claimed and the other is totally denied, but he admits the small slave, even though there's two different people, like two different types of grain, still we call that modeh b'miksat. Okay, so now we answer the third question for Rav Sheshat. Akate helahu. Hold on. So far, nobody answered the second question, which is if the modeh b'miksat guy, even in a regular case of someone claims 100, he says, I'll pay you 50. Here's the 50. Forget about that half of the claim. Now it's gone. And now the rest of the claim is 50, and he denies the entirety. So then he does not have to make a vow. So what about that? Amarava abda diktat liyadeh v'sadeh shechafar ba borosh shichin u'me'arot. Rava says where this Mishnah is assuming a case where the item that he's going to return is ruined and cannot return it anymore. For example, if the seller cut off the hand of the small slave, so then the buyer says, I don't want that. I bought a slave with two hands. This one has one hand. I'm not accepting it. He doesn't have to accept it. And so therefore he cannot return it. Or the small field got all full of ditches and pits and is not usable anymore. So he can no longer say, here it is. Instead, he has nothing to give. And therefore, he is modeh b'miksat, because there's no helach in this case. משלם כשעת הגזלה. רבי מאיר אומר, בעבדים אומר לו, הרי שלך לפניך. Hold on. Challenge to Rav Sheshat, who was assuming that a slave is like a movable item according to the Rabbi Meir. But here in this Mishnah from Masechet Baba Kama, we find out the opposite. That the Mishnah says, if someone steals an animal and it got old after he stole it, so at the time he stole it, it was nice and healthy, it was worth $1,000, and now all the time he has it, the older it gets, the less is its value, and now it went down to $700. Or he stole slaves, and then they got older in the meantime, and so now they're only worth $700. And so now he gets caught, or he comes to pay on his own. And so now how much is he going to pay? The $1,000 or what it isn't worth now? And the answer is he has to pay the higher amount at the time that he stole it. It was worth $1,000, and it was under his own property, when it was under his under his domain, that it went down in value. But he has to pay at the time that he stole it. That is the opinion of Tanakama. Now, even Tanakama would agree that if he stole land, and the land got then deteriorated, that he would not have to pay at the time that he stole it, because land cannot be stolen. Land is just there. You can't move it, right? What does that mean to even steal land? You can go and squat on it and make believe you're the owner, but really the land is never transfers into the domain of the thief, and therefore for land this would not be true. So we see that according to Tanakama, slaves are the same as movable property. Rabbi Meir disagrees, and he says regarding slaves, regarding slaves you can say, here's your slave, which means that Rabbi Meir is equating slaves to property. That just like with property, he could just give it back, and even though it became worth less in the meantime, so to slaves, just give it back as is. So you see, the Rabbi Meir is the one that says slaves are like land. So that challenges Rav Sheshat. Al halak halakashya kedem achalif rabba bar avu v'tane. Rabbi Meir omer meshalem kishat gezela. Hachamim omrim omer lo ba'abadim harei shelecha lefanecha. We have no problem with that because we can switch around the opinions, which Rabba bar avu already does. According to this version, Rabbi Meir thinks that the thief pays at the time that he stole it. And that will apply to movable items and slaves. So slaves are like movable items. And Chachamim, they disagree, and they say, regarding slaves, he just says, here's the slave that's the same as land. So Chachamim are the ones that say slaves and land are the same, and Meir says that slaves are like movable items, and so that's what Rav Sheshet is relying on that. Makshinan karka le'ibed, ma ibed nishba'in af karka nishba'in, dilma ibed hu de nishba'in, aval karka la. So now another follow-up question against Rav Sheshet, because remember in our Mishnah it mentioned the case not only of two slaves and they're arguing a bigger one, a small one. It also talks about land, and so according to Rav Sheshet, how's he going to answer the question about land, that there's a modeh b'miksat requirement even regarding land? We ask, since Rabbi Meir seems to be saying that land and slaves are the same because they're both mentioned in the Mishnah. Those are the two cases. And would he say that just like regarding a slave, there is modeh b'miksat and he has to make a vow, and so too regarding land, even for land you have to make a vow? Or is that what he's going to say? Or will he claim that in the Mishnah is only talking about the case of slave, that's where he has to make a vow. But regarding land, even though it included that in the Mishnah, but that clause about vow only applies to the example of slaves, but not regarding the example of land. Or how is he going to say that? How is Meir going to interpret this Mishnah? In order to clarify this, let's compare what Rabbi Meir says in another source. This is a Braita. La sakadatech דתניא המחליף פרה בחמור וילדה וכן המוכר שפחתו וילדה. זה אומר ברשותי וזה שותק זכה. זה אומר אני יודע וזה אומר אני יודע יחלוקו. זה אומר ברשותי וזה אומר ברשותי שבא מוכר שברשותו ילדה. לפי שכל נשבעים שבתורה נשבעים ולא משלמים. דברי רבי מאיר. החכמים אומרים אין נשבעים לא על העבדים ולא על הקרקעות. למה? מכלל דרבי מאיר סבר נשבעים. So you should not think that Rabbi Meir makes any distinction between slaves and land, and in fact, according to Rabbi Meir, one would make a vow of modeh b'miksat, not only in slaves, but also in land. And that would solve the problem in our Mishnah. Yes, in fact, he does make a slave. And we're going to prove this from the following Baraita. Baraita says, if someone switches a cow with a donkey and it gives birth at some point, and we don't know exactly when, or he sold a maidservant who was pregnant and it gave birth at some point, and each one makes a claim. The seller says, no, it gave birth while it was in my domain, and therefore I own the offspring. And the other one says, doesn't say anything, meaning he doesn't know. So the seller, since he is bari, he knows, he gets the offspring. If the one says, I don't know, and the other says, I also don't know, well, then they split the difference, like we saw. If one says, it was definitely gave birth when it was in my domain, and the other one says, no, it gave birth when it was in my possession, then the seller makes a vow that it gave birth while it was still in his possession before the transaction. Why does he do that? Because regarding all vows that are required from the Torah, he has to make a vow and then he does not have to pay, according to the Rabbi Meir. Okay, now notice, this case here was only talking about cows and maidservants. It didn't say anything about land. But however, Chachamim in their response say, we do not make vows, not for slaves and not for land. Since Chachamim in their rebuttal say, not for slaves and not for land, can't we infer that Rabbi Meir would disagree and say, we do make modeh b'miksat vow on slaves and also land? So you see, this is a proof that Rabbi Meir says you do make modeh b'miksat vow on slaves and also land. Is that a good proof? We say no, mimai. Dilma keshem ka'amru le. Kiyechi deodit lan bekarkaot ode lan name ba'abadim. Not necessarily. Maybe they were just making an argument from something that Rabbi Meir actually agrees on, and therefore that should be comparable to something that he said he doesn't agree on. And their argument is as follows: just like you would agree with us regarding land, that there is no modeh b'miksat mideoraita vow that's applicable to land, so you should agree with us also regarding avadim. In other words, since they're the same, and avadim slaves are within the category of land, you agree with that land. no vow, so you should agree also with avadim. But really, they both agree that land, there is no vow, and the only disagreement is regarding slaves. And so there is no proof here that Rabbi Meir thinks that one has to make a vow also for land. And we double down on that conclusion. Teda, ditnan. Rabbi Meir omer, yesh devrim shem kekarka ve'enan kekarka, ve'en chachamim modim lo. Kesad, 10 גפנים טעונות מסרתי לך, ועלה אומר אינן אלא 5. רבי מאיר מחייב, חכמים אומרים, כל מחובר לקרקע, הרי הוא כקרקע. After all, look at this Mishnah in Masechet Shavuot, where Rabbi Meir says there are some things that are like land in one way, but actually not like land in a different way. Chachamim disagree with him. What is such an example? Let's say someone says, I gave you 10 vines full of grapes, and the seller says, so you owe me money, you have to pay me for 10, and they're still attached to the ground we're talking about. And the buyer says, no, you only gave me 5, and therefore I only have to pay for 5 vines laden with grapes. So this is modeh b'miksat. He is agreeing that he has to pay 5. He denies that he has to pay the other 5. Therefore, Rabbi Meir says he is liable to make a vow. He'll pay 5 that he agrees with, that he admits, and he'll make a vow for the rest. And Chachamim say, no, it's attached to the ground, and therefore it's like the ground. Anything attached to the ground is like selling, if he sold a big piece of land, a small piece of land, and there's no vow on land, and therefore there's no vow on anything attached to the ground. Now, regarding this Mishnah, V'amar Rabbi Yosef bar Chanina, Anavim amdot libasedika benayhu. Demor sabar kibsurot amyan, umor sabar lav kibsurot amyan. What's the essence of their controversy? Rabbi Yosef bar Chanina said that they were talking about grapes that are ready to be picked. They're all nice and ripe. And Rabbi Meir thinks that since they're ready to be picked, it's like they're already picked, and therefore we treat them like movable items, and therefore he make a vow. Whereas the rabbis say, they're not picked yet, I don't care if they're ready, they're still attached to the ground, therefore they are like the ground, and you do not make a vow. What's the point of all this? It's that Rabbi Meir agrees that if it were considered attached to the ground, or if it was ground itself, then you would not make a vow. So you see that Rabbi Meir does not think that the ground, selling that if you modem miksat in the case of land, that you'd make a vow, and therefore he cannot be the author of our Mishnah. It won't solve the problem in the case of land, where the Mishnah says that he makes a vow. Ela le'olam k'Rabbi Hoshaya. Rather, we're going to go back to the interpretation of Rabbi Hoshaya, who said, we're talking about a case where someone sells a slave with his clothes on it, or land together with the grain that's on it. He's selling both together. And therefore, since it's part of it is movable stuff, and part of it is land or a slave. Now, even though a land or slave by themselves, you would not make a vow modeh b'miksat, since it's together with a movable item, the clothing or the sheaves that are sitting on the land. Therefore, once you make a vow for the movable items, so we bind that together with a vow for the land. Now, we asked about that, udekashialach, zokekin isterich, and we challenged that because we already know from Mishnah Masechet Kiddushin, the law of binding. So what is this coming to add? Oh, actually, we have an answer to that. And we didn't have to go and find a different answer altogether. I might have thought that the clothing of the slave is part of the slave himself. It's not considered a separate thing. And the same thing with the sheaves of the field are like the field itself. It's a minor item that's compared to the slave. If you're selling a slave, it comes along with the clothes that he's wearing. What you have to keep his clothes and deliver him naked? You're going to take off all the things from the land, right? It means that it's going to come with the things in the land, but they're not independently significant. So I might have thought that we treat the land by the land is the main focus, and there's no vow on the land, there's no vow on the slaves, and the garments are just incidental. And that's what I might have thought. Therefore, this Mishnah according to the Bioshaya, comes to teach us, not so. We treat the garment and the sheaves as an independent thing. And so this solves all the problems. This is not a question of he's admitting to one thing and denying something else. Here, he's denying part of the clothing. Remember, we're talking about clothing that's small and you can make it bigger with more material, so he's agreeing to some, and he's denying the rest of it. And we're not talking about just land and slaves. We're talking about, in fact, movable items. And regarding the helach, the second question, you have to say that it's the slave or the land is damaged in some way, so that he cannot simply deliver that itself. So instead, he has to, when he denies part of it, he really is denying part of it, and he cannot deliver and just say helach. And so that answers all of the questions. Okay, finally, ze omer eni yodea v'ze omer eni yodea yachloku. Now we're looking at the baraita, which was a case of a cow or a maidservant that gave birth, and if each of them says, I don't know when it gave birth, before or after the transaction, so they split it down the middle. Hamaneh sumchos hi damar mamon mutabas safek chulkin. So who's author of this baraita? It must be Sumchos. That says, for sure, everybody agrees, when it's Shema and Shema, then you split it down the middle. But look in that baraita. The case after that says, if each one is sure, this was the seller says, it gave birth while it was still under my possession. And the buyer says, no, we already made the transaction. It gave birth under my possession, and it's mine. In that case, the seller makes a vow that it was under his, and he keeps the difference, he keeps the offspring. Now that's fine according to the other opinion that Sumchus only says bari bari, but according to Rav Huna, who said that Sumchus would say, also in the case of certain claims, that they split it. So since you already established that Sumchus is the author of this baraita, so why does it say that the seller makes a vow and keeps the whole thing? It should be that they split it. And the answer is Modeh Sumchus hechad ika shivuah deoraita v'dik ta'ah liyada kederava. Sumchus agrees, as we already saw before, when there is a deoraita obligation to make a vow, then that's it. Once Torah says you have to make a vow, you're not going to split it. If it says make a vow, that means to make a vow and keep the whole thing or not pay the whole thing. It wouldn't be fair to split it, yet one side makes a vow and the other side doesn't. And so therefore, since there's a vow in that case imposed by the Torah, they do not split it. And you also have to say that it's a case where his hand got cut off, the maidservant's head got cut off, or the cow was damaged and they could not therefore just give the item itself, because then that would be helach, and says, here, I admit to that, I'm giving it to you, and then the rest of it, he is denying the whole thing. So it has to be a case where he could not actually deliver the thing that he agrees to. Next Mishnah, HaMocher zetav le'esim v'asu pachot merevi'it l'se'ah, hare elu shel ba'al hazetim. Asu revi'it l'se'ah, ze omer zetai gidelu v'ze omer arsi gidela. Yachloku. Someone sells his olive trees not to produce olives, but for their wood. He's like, listen, I'm done with these olive trees, and they lasted a while, and now that's it, I'm ready to plant new olive trees, but you can cut them down and take them for wood. So obviously they're not going to be as expensive as olive trees that grow nice olives, but they're good for burning as wood. So he sells it to them. And now he didn't come and cut them down right away, but he left them for a little while, and they grew some olives. So can the buyer keep those olives? So it depends. How much olive oil will they make? How good are these olives? If they're not such great quality, such that they're going to produce less than a revi'it of oil per se'ah of land, then the owner of the olive tree can keep that. That's very little. The seller is not going to care about that. However, if they're high quality olives and they produce a revi'it of oil per selah, per se'ah, then they're going to have a fight about it, and the purchaser will say, "Oh, I bought these vines here. I bought this olive tree, and therefore it's my olive tree that made these olives, so I get to keep the olives and the olive oil that comes from it." Whereas the owner says, "Yeah, but it's growing on my land. It's my good land that nourished them, and therefore these olives belong to me, right? I only sold you the wood, so you should have just taken the wood and gone away. But now you left them there, and my land produced these olives, so they're mine." They each have a valid claim, and therefore they split the profits. But if it's less than that, then it's not even worth talking about. Shataf nahar zetav untanam letoch sedeh habero. Ze omer zetai gidelu, ze omer arsi gidela yachloku. A new case where someone has some olive trees, and a river came, swept away the olive trees, and put them into his neighbor's field, and they took root and they grew olives. So now they each have a claim. The one who owns the olive trees says, "These are my olive trees, and so the olives belong to me." Whereas the owner of the new land says, "Yeah, but it's my land." And so here, it's not a question that we don't know who it belongs to. We know exactly what happened. It's just that they both have good claims, because in fact you need good land and good olive trees to produce these nice olives. And therefore, since they both have proper claims, they split the olives between them. Hechi dameh. Now we ask about the opening case, what exactly are the details? If the owner of the olive tree says, "Take them and cut them right now, right? I want to clear it away. I want you to take it right away." Then, even if it grows just a little bit, very bad olives that produce less than a revi'it, it should be owned by the landowner. Because he said he wanted these things to be cleared right away, and then you left them here and they grew olives, so now these olives are mine. If the owner said, "You can cut them anytime you want, I don't care, come anytime you want," so then the buyer owns these trees, and he doesn't have an obligation to cut them down right away. If they grow olives, even if they grow very good olives and that produce more than the revi'it, the buyer who now owns the olive trees should be able to keep them. So which case is it talking about? So rather it's talking about a case where they did not say any specification regarding the timing of when he should cut down the trees, and therefore we just go by the normal presumption. Usually, if it produces less than the revi'it, so the seller is not going to care about that, right? You bought the trees, and okay, there's some olives on them, not so much. They don't make so much oil. I don't care about that. You could keep it. But if it produces a lot and says, "Well, you didn't cut them down, and now look, they produced all these olives. I only sold you the trees. I didn't sell you the olives and the olive oil. That is mine because it grew while it was still attached before you took them." So in that case, since he is particular about it, well, then they will divide, because in fact he only owns the land and the other guy owns the trees, so that will be the case where they split it. Rabbi Shimon ben Pazi just adds that when you're calculating the revi'it, it's not exactly that it's enough olives per se'ah that will produce a revi'it of olive oil, but rather the value of revi'it minus the expenses. It costs a lot of money to produce the olive oil, to press them from the olives to the olive oil. So you calculate that, you subtract that, and if after you subtract that expense, the value of the oil that's produced is still more than a revi'it per se'ah, then that's considered a significant amount, and they would have to split it. But if it's less than that, then the buyer of the trees can keep it. Baruch Adonai Le'olam, Amen ve'amen.